Okay, first thing I want to do is start the recording. Here we go. So first of all, thank you to everyone for joining us this evening. You may have noticed that this afternoon I updated the flyer. Maybe you saw that if you got it through WhatsApp. And now, in what way did I update the flyer? In a very important way. I updated the flyer by, let me actually see if I can show it to you. I don't think so. Let's see. Oh yeah, I can here. Look at this. So here's the flyer. Can you all see that? Westwood Kehillah presents human dignity. What to do when the Torah conflicts with the demands of human dignity. Okay, there's the information. Here we go. Le'ilu nishmas Ariel Chaim ben Reuven Yaakov v'Chasya, in memory of Ariel Avrich. FYI, I spelled Ariel wrong. Okay, I have a minhag. My minhag is spelled people's names wrong. It drives Andy crazy. Okay, but Ariel should have been with an E, not an A. Those of you that ever davened at Yik are familiar with the Avrich family. Robert and Karen Avrich. Robert is a screenwriter. He wrote Stranger Among Us, amongst other films. And Karen Avrich is a school psychologist who's very popular here in the city. She does a lot of testing for the frum community, especially. A wonderful couple that I've known since 1994. Long time. Our relationship goes back a long time. Their son, Ariel, whose yahrzeit is tonight, the first day of Tammuz. So the shir will be Li'li Nishmaso. Ariel Avrich joined Yeshiva Gedola from Hillel. Very unusual move. I don't know if he was the only boy in the history of Hillel that went to Yeshiva Gedola, but certainly one of the few. And he joined Yeshiva Gedola by skipping 8th grade. I think he had his bar mitzvah when he was in 9th grade, or it was just before 9th grade started. One of the younger boys in the class, certainly, if not the youngest. When he was in 9th grade, he got a brain tumor. It returned in 11th grade. And he was a wonderful, wonderful person. He developed into a real Talmid Chacham. He had the most beautiful handwriting. His parents still have his notebooks. He used to write with a fountain pen. It's the first and only time I've ever seen someone use a fountain pen. And for years and years and years, he wrote. Shiurim. What stands out about him in terms of his learning is he never wanted to get stuck behind. So back then we had these micro cassette recorders, and we would go ahead and record the shiurim for him, and then ride our bikes over to the hospital, drop them off, and he would listen to the shiurim that way. The Rabbi would borrow his notebooks to see exactly what they said and how they said it. You know, his notes were that good. And he joined me in Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. It was the only place that he was able to go to yeshiva because Dr. Yoel Jacobowitz is a physician and who lives on the campus. And he ultimately passed away Rosh Chodesh Tammuz. I think it's Taf Shin Samach Gimel. I'll tell you in a second for sure. I think it was 2003, if I'm not mistaken. I'll tell you a beautiful story that just happened. You know, his parents every single year, looking at, Tafshin Samach Gimel is correct. Every single year, his parents do some sort of event to commemorate his life and do something in his memory. First few years was shiurim, and then it kind of became immersion into the political topics. Last year, was a Sefer Torah dedication, and they did not have anything planned for this year because of COVID. So I'm thrilled that I was able to kind of remind myself. I'll tell you how I reminded myself of this, of the fact that his yahrzeit was tonight in a moment. But I'm thrilled that we're able to do something with a nice tzibor, with a nice crowd. That'll not only is a topic that is obviously Torah and should be Li'li Nishmaso in his memory, but it's a topic that is that represents who he was. He was all about kavod habrios. He was all about human dignity. He was the most dignified person you could ever imagine. A sweetheart, gentle person. You used to ask him, "How are you feeling, Ariel?" He'd be like, "Baruch Hashem, a little better." You know, lying through his teeth because I doubt, you know, he really was feeling any better. But he never complained. Never complained. Unfortunately, he passed away not from cancer but from chemo side effects that ruined his lungs, and he wasn't able to get a donor in time. He was buried originally in Simi Valley, but then they moved him to Eretz Yisrael. So Yeshiva Gedola recently, they just published it, and they're in the midst of distributing it. They published a sefer, and there's a page here. Let me see if I could share it with you here in a moment. AirDrop. See if it works. Here we go. I'm going to show this to you now, just so you can see it. It's very. Hold on a second. Here we go. So my friend Avrami Gross, who is the son of Rabbi Gross, he shared this with me this afternoon. So I'm just going to read it to you. This is one of the dedication pages of a sefer that was published by alumni of the yeshiva, in which they wrote various articles of Torah. So he quotes a pasuk, very famous pasuk. I think Ilana knows the pasuk by heart. V'nasati b'beiti v'chomati yad v'shem. Okay, this is where Yad Vashem, the famous Holocaust museum, gets their name from, that I put into my home and to my walls. Yad, a hand, Vashem, and a name, basically a zikaron, a memorial. Lemizkeres netzach, for an eternal remembrance, ulili nishmas, and for the uplifting of his soul. Habachor hayakar, the precious young man, Yanik v'chacham, who was a v'chakim, which meant that he drank of everybody's wisdom. Adin hanefesh, the most gentle of souls, v'atzil haruach, also the most, the opposite of a type A personality, basically. A very, very gentle person. Niktaf b'dmei yamav, he was gathered up by Hashem when he was very young. Habachar achashav, Ariel Chaim, Ben Ibad al-Chaim, Tovim Reuven Yaakov, Echasya Avrich, that's Robert and Karen Avrich. Olav nis'ale b'Torah, v'yira shemayim b'yeshiva seina kedosha. He went up different levels in Torah and Yira Shamayim and fear of heaven in our holy yeshiva. Lamad b'shkeida v'asmad atzuma. He learned with tremendous diligence until he became sick. And the truth is that this is a mistake. He learned with incredible diligence even after he became sick. He was cleansed through tremendous difficulties that he experienced. And he accepted his suffering with love. Hichsir nishmasa tahora leginze meromim b'yom hamar aleph tammuz tavshin tzamach gimel. He passed away on that day. Tei nishmasa tzura b'tzar hachayim. May his memory serve for a blessing, etc. Hunsach haydei chaver. This is dedicated by his friend Yossi Shiner, Yehuda Kaplan, Yeshua Barber, Avram Stewart. That's me. Ari Miller, Ari Wiesel, and Avrami Gross. They're all dear friends of mine from high school. Now, I want to tell you something amazing. Listen to this beautiful story. As I told you that because of COVID-19, the Avrichs were not able to do anything public. Maybe they thought about doing something on Zoom and they decided against it. I'm not sure, but they decided not to do anything, on a big scale. Usually they do something at Yik and they serve a beautiful breakfast. And they elected not to do that this year, obviously with everything going on with the pandemic. And the secretary from Yeshiva Gedola lives, I don't know if she lives on Cardiff, but she lives down the street from the Avrichs. And Rabbi Gross, they'd already distributed some of the Svarim, some of these books, but it came to the next batch that they wanted to distribute. And she says, why do you want to ship it to them through UPS? Let me just drop it off. They live a few doors away from me. And so she took the sefer and she dropped it off and she showed them the dedication page. And that I believe that happened today. So when did they get the sefer? On the eve of his yard site. And they had no idea it was coming. They knew nothing about this. No one. Just coincidentally, as Bob Katz would say, coincidentally, the way Hashem makes things work. So I'm excited to share Divrei Torah Lilu Nishmaso about the concept of kavod habrios, or human dignity. So I thank everybody for giving me the time to make that introduction, and I'm going to be sharing obviously the recording of tonight's shir with the Avrichs. I know that Mrs. Avrich has a Tehillim group tonight in his memory. And it's very bakavadik that we have a very nice group here together to share. Okay, so the topic of kavod habrios is one that is, kavod habrios literally means to respect humanity. Now, of course, respect of humanity is a hot topic. I'm not going to speak about it from the sense of a hot topic, but rather from a halachic perspective. But it's a fascinating, fascinating discussion, and I think you'll enjoy it as much as I have. In fact, ever since Brachos Daf Yud Tes, today Shabbos, the Daf Yomi is already up to Daf Kuf Hey or so, Kuf Vav, so already a few months ago, maybe 5 months ago or so, I've been thinking about saying a shir on this topic. So I'm excited to finally get to it tonight. And again, I thank everyone so much for joining us. Okay, so what's the starting point of our shir? Kavod habrios, again, if you want to unmute yourself, you're welcome to do so by pressing the space bar or just raising your hand, asking questions, etc. Okay. We're going to look at a couple of classic examples, but before we do that, I just want to give you really just like a number of questions that come up in halacha, where you'll see that there's a conflict between the halacha and between what you might call, human dignity. I'm just going to read a series of questions that are kind of, germane to the issue. Okay. These are different examples of kavod habrios, or respect for humanity, found in the Talmud and in the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish law. Imagine you find someone on the street and they are wearing shatnez. What should they do? Shatnez, of course, is a mixture of wool and linen. It's prohibited to wear wool and linen together. Hashem says, do not wear clothing made from wool and linen. And the Gemara is speaking about a case of where, I don't know how many layers they wore, but let's just assume that every layer the person was wearing was made from shatnez. And he becomes aware of that while he's walking in public. And now he has a choice: violate the Torah by wearing clothing mixed with wool and linen, or remove his clothing and degrade himself in public. So there you have a conflict of ideas. You have a conflict of a mitzvah versus the human aspect. What should you do? Another example, classic example. Can a Kohen normally is not supposed to be metame himself to a dead person, which means a Kohen is not supposed to go to a funeral unless the body is in a separate area. A Kohen does not go to a cemetery. And that's because the Torah says that a Kohen is not supposed to come into contact, halachic contact, with a person that's passed away. Well, what happens if a Kohen finds unfortunately, a sad case, happens in times of war more frequently, but finds a dead body on the side of the road? What's the halacha? There's the issue of the human dignity of the dead person, the kavod hames, the honor and the respect due to a person who passed away, and then there's obviously the mitzvah of for the Kohen not to come into contact. How does the Kohen deal with that conflict? Okay. Similarly, a Kohen is undressed in a room or in a house, and he finds out that a person passed away in the house. Is he allowed to get dressed before leaving? Again, you have a conflict. A death occurs on Shabbat, and the body, this is before refrigeration, air conditioning, etc. Before pickups, before Chava Kadisha had a pickup service, and of course, on the one hand, the person himself needs to be properly cared for, and it's not respectful to leave him here. On the other hand, Shabbos, and on the other hand, it's also not so good for the people in the house to have the body nearby with decay setting in. So what do you do? Normally a dead body is considered to be muktzah. So, how would you handle that? There are less severe cases of where there are conflicts. I'll give you just one. It's almost a silly example, but the halacha is that somebody who's in mourning is not supposed to get a haircut. Well, what happens if somebody is in the middle of getting a haircut and the barber has shaved half their head, and then they find out that their close relative passed away? What are they supposed to do? Okay, so it sounds like a silly sort of example, right? But it just kind of brings out the idea that on the one hand, there's the halacha, the letter of the law, which tells you that you're supposed to go ahead and you're supposed to follow the letter of the law. On the other hand, there's a concept, which is a very important concept, called kavod habrios. And kavod habrios essentially means that there's an aspect of the human being, of the dignity of a human being, that you need to be respectful of and to, and therefore it's important that, perhaps at certain times, we would take the Torah or the rabbinic law and say, it should not be applied at this time. So what are those sorts of principles? What do you do when respect for human beings contradicts the mandate of the Torah? How do you balance these conflicting ideas? In the normal circumstances in the secular world, what are ethics? Ethics, which we'll talk a lot about tomorrow night in a much more textual kind of a shiur, is to figure out a moral compass that guides, proper behavior. We also have ethics in Judaism, And of course, we have our Torah that guides our ethics. And a lot of our ethics are legislated. And so we try to identify principles that the Talmud has to offer and apply them to modern challenges in very complex and difficult situations. In general, and there's a second, that's one introduction, okay? A second introduction, and this is a very important idea, is that in general, the rule is that there is no conflict between human dignity and the Torah mandate. What do I mean by that? That there's no conflict between the Torah and the way it's meant to be kept and human dignity. The Torah has a rule. It's found in Proverbs. Diracheha darchei noam. The ways of the Torah are ways of pleasantness. I always thought that, by the way, from the fact that, my Rabbi Tendler, one of my Rebbeim, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, used to say that men are obligated to have children, women are not obligated to have children. Why not? There's no mitzvah for a woman to have a child. Obviously, a man cannot have a child without a woman. If I was telling this to my children, I would say without a wife. But obviously, a man without a woman cannot bear a child. Impossible. But why is that said Rabbi Tendler? Because the ways of Torah are pleasant, and childbirth is not. Even with epidurals, it's not pleasant. So Torah doesn't require somebody to do something that's unpleasant. So I always thought, therefore, if that's true, if the logic is correct, that means that anything the Torah does require from us is by definition not unpleasant. Now you may not, some of it might be like dry red wine. You might have to come to learn to appreciate with time. It doesn't mean you're going to love it the first time you do it, but by definition, its ways are ways that are pleasant. So in general, when there is a conflict between human dignity and the Torah mandate, like we said, the system and the way it's supposed to run, the Torah is designed that keeping Torah, keeping mitzvot, are not meant to be a major life challenge or a terrible hardship. They're not supposed to make a person depressed or angry. It's supposed to conform with the needs of a human being. God created the human being. God created the Torah. It's a framework to help us maximize our spirituality, but not necessarily at the cost of our physicality. It's meant to perfect a human being. Of course, no system is perfect, and there are going to be conflicts that arise even within the system. So that's what we're talking about tonight, when there's a minority of times when things conflict. So how do you deal with it? Another brief introduction is we never find a source that, we never use the term never. We always refuse to use the term never. Okay, but there's never a source to find a mitzvah that's embarrassing. Can you think of a mitzvah that's embarrassing? Okay, is it embarrassing to put on tefillin? It's not embarrassing to put on tefillin. Would you be embarrassed to put on tefillin in an airport? Maybe. In an airplane on your way to Dubai? Would that be easy for you? Right? Maybe not. Maybe that wouldn't be the easiest thing for you. But we're talking about somebody who's putting on tefillin regularly. Obviously, they're going to figure out a way to put on their tefillin. If you are embarrassed about a particular mitzvah, you're not going to find an exemption from doing that mitzvah. Does that make sense? You can nod along with me. I know you're muted. If you're embarrassed to do a particular mitzvah at a particular time, you're not necessarily going to find an exemption from doing that mitzvah. A friend of mine told me that he was on an airplane and he was wearing his tefillin. He was standing in the back of the plane, and the stewardess came over to him. The flight attendant came over to him and said, "Wow, those are just so beautiful." Now, tefillin, I don't know if they're beautiful. They're remarkable looking, perhaps. They're black leather boxes and leather straps. I don't know if beautiful is the adjective you'd use to describe tefillin if you're a secular or a non-Jewish person. You might say, is that a bomb? Is that a radio? What is that on your arms? What is that on your head? To say that tefillin is beautiful, and then he realized that she was talking about his tefillin bag and the plastic boxes, which actually were quite beautiful. But it's the only time in his life that he's ever been accused of wearing beautiful tefillin. So this kind of embarrassment, when you're embarrassed to do a mitzvah because of a particular scenario or a situation in which you find yourself, that is not necessarily what we're speaking about, because you're not really going to find exemptions in those cases. That's not considered a conflict that allows you to violate a commandment or to not keep a commandment. In the olden days when you had to daven and you were in public, what did you do? You joined Clark Kent, right? You went into a phone booth. You picked up the phone, you pretend you're talking, and you daven to Hashem. Anyone here ever did that? I never did that, but I've read stories. Yeah, okay. I've read stories of people that have done that kind of a thing. Nowadays it's hard to find a phone booth. people, try to avoid situations. A friend of mine told me that his son was flying from, just from San Jose to LA. So he said to his son, he goes, so when are you going to daven? He says, I don't want to daven in the airport. I want to daven on the plane, but I'll land in LA with plenty of time to daven, so I'll put on my tefillin then, It's a reasonable sort of thing. When you're flying, though, to Dubai or to Israel's pretty easy, but when you're flying to other places, it can be challenging. The Ramah says, Moshe Isserles, the author of the Ashkenazi Shulchan Aruch, says, don't be embarrassed in front of people. Try to overcome that social or peer pressure and realize that you're serving Hashem and what you're doing is inherently not embarrassing. You're only embarrassed because of some sort of social construct. He says, you can learn to live with that. So that's when it comes to a mitzvah that's not inherently embarrassing, it's just that situationally it could be embarrassing. On Sukkot, carrying your lulav and your esrog down the street, and your neighbors call 911 because they think you're carrying a rifle case. Yeah, okay, it could be a bit awkward. I know, for me, this kind of thing was never awkward, but I can imagine for some people, it might be a little bit awkward. And my brother was on a flight over Cholamoid Sukkot or before Sukkot, and he was carrying a lulav with him. And the security stopped him and they said, what is that? He says, oh, it's a palm frond. Oh, no problem, just walk right in. He didn't bother explaining the religious, significance or symbolism or importance. He just said, oh, I'm carrying a palm frond, no problem. You want to carry plants to California? No, we understand that. So these are feelings that we could potentially overcome. That's not the type of conflict that we will be discussing. The type of conflict we'll be discussing is because of true embarrassment. And again, because of human dignity, the Torah is sensitive to it, as we'll see. But of course, there are, strict and parameters and many rules involved. Outside of Southern California, perhaps parts of France, I don't know, I've never been to France, but not having any clothing on is embarrassing. Would you all agree with that? Okay. The Torah tells us that, doesn't it? Adam and Chava were embarrassed. And they were embarrassed. Yet, as we said before, in the Torah, there's a prohibition to wear wool and linen together. And if you find yourself in the middle of the street and you realize that you're wearing a combination of wool and linen, now, you're not embarrassed of the mitzvah. Under normal circumstances, there's no big deal. The problem is you're embarrassed to be without clothing in public. So that's recognized as a potentially valid form of embarrassment. And the Gemara discusses that situation. Okay. The next situation, so that's the first situation we're going to use kind of as an archetype, as a classic example. And there's another classic example which we're going to use as well. It's a difficult situation, but it's hopefully not a common situation, but it has happened more than you might expect in history. Rabbi Yehuda Landau, he was the Nodeb Yehuda, I believe he was a rabbi in Prague. Those of you that have been to Europe, to Prague, have probably been to his shul. He's famous for the Golem, right? The Maharal of Prague. I'm sorry, I think it's the same person, Rabbi Yehuda Landau. But the most difficult questions of his generation, of his time, came to his desk. And someone sent him a letter. Nowadays, we don't have letters anymore, we have emails. But somebody sent him a letter. And the letter had to do with a difficult case, a very strange case. We all know that the Torah, forget society, the Torah in the Ten Commandments prohibits adultery, doesn't it? For a woman who's married to one person, for her to have an intimate physical affair, I'm not saying an emotional affair is allowed, but certainly a physical affair is a problem. It's usher, it's prohibited. And if she does do that, then not only is she prohibited to her husband, she's prohibited to the person that she had the affair with. So that's the halacha, asr lebal, asr leboel. So listen to this letter that somebody sent him. God forbid, like we said, a woman commits adultery, it breaks the halachic relationship between her husband and herself. The person wrote, I know a certain woman who committed adultery. I happen to know about it. Her husband has no idea. Should I share the information with her husband? Do I tell him? This question came up 250 years ago. And now what's the obvious response to the person asking the question? How do you know something the husband doesn't know? The answer is, it was him. He was the one who had the affair with her. Now, to make the situation even more difficult, he gives the background and I guess what happened a little bit later. It was like a 1700s version of an Airbnb, and he was boarding in their house, and I guess the husband was absent, and sparks flew, and they developed this connection, this relationship. Now, she really liked this guy, obviously, and her husband also really liked this guy whenever he was around. So they married him to their daughter. Okay, so his question is, should I tell my father-in-law that I had an affair with my mother-in-law? And obviously that would break up her marriage. Certainly, it would be a disgrace to the entire family. I don't think his marriage would be intact, but that's not for halachic reasons, but just psychological reasons. Okay? So that's a classic example. And unfortunately, it's something that, I don't know about the second part of it, where it's the mother-in-law part of it, but the other part of it is, unfortunately, it happens more often than you might think. I have never been faced with this shaila in Westwood, Baruch Hashem. Hope to never have such a shaila in Westwood. But my uncle is a posek, and he gets his shaila more often than you might think. Okay, things happen. So that's the question number one. From a halachic perspective, he's not allowed to remain married to his wife, the father-in-law. From the perspective of human dignity and the sanity and the disgrace of the family, obviously, there's what to be concerned about. Does everyone follow that question? Okay, some of you are nodding, others of you are frozen by pictures, and others are just names. Okay. Second example, and this one is probably more common. I have not been asked this question, but I could have been asked the question, is somebody has a scar. We'll call it the Harry Potter scar. Can everyone show me with their hands where Harry Potter's scar is? Exactly, very good, right along their forehead. Imagine, God forbid, you have a scar like that, right? And then you have a conversation with someone you don't know. What are they looking at? They're looking at your scar. Now, what if it wasn't there? What if it was, I don't know, on your face, or on your nose, or I don't know, some place that was really, even the forehead would be bad enough. So what do they do nowadays to remove scars? Well, they can try to remove the scar, but they're going to create another scar, right? So what do they do nowadays? Anybody know? They tattoo the color of the skin over the scar itself. It's called micropigmentation. Micropigmentation. Now, according to the Torah, you're allowed to get a tattoo? Everyone knows you're not allowed to get a tattoo. Did you know that the most commonly asked question, I don't know if it's still true, but it was years ago, most commonly asked question to an Ask the Rabbi website was, if you have a tattoo, can be buried in a Jewish cemetery. I don't know where that myth comes from, but it's not true. What's not true? It's not true that if you have a tattoo that you cannot be buried in a Jewish cemetery. You may be buried in a Jewish cemetery even if you have a tattoo. Now, halachically, are you allowed to get a tattoo? No. Are there different kinds of tattoos from a halachic perspective? Yeah, of course. There's Rabbanon, there's Torah, there's different kinds of tattoos. The Torah prohibits getting a tattoo. If a person has a tattoo, let's say somebody is converted to Judaism, they have tattoos from before they were Jewish. Should they cover them up? They don't have to. They don't have to. Are they allowed to cover them up with micropigmentation? It's actually a whole shir. Are they even allowed to have them removed because you're causing a wound to yourself? Because you're not supposed to self-wound, self-injure. So you have a conflict. On the one hand, the Torah says, don't get a tattoo. On the other hand, having a facial scar, which is embarrassing, right? Again, you're not embarrassed of the mitzvah. You're not embarrassed about not getting a tattoo. But there's embarrassment there in the sense that you're walking around in life with a scar on your face, God forbid. And this happens as well, sometimes somebody gets a tattoo when they weren't supposed to, and they got it on their face. Can you imagine? People getting tattoos in such visible places where they can't cover it up, even if they're not in the mood to show it off. And now they want to remove it, or they want to do micropigmentation. Is it allowed? So the Talmud has a contradiction. The Talmud on the one hand says, Ein chachma vein tzvuna neged Hashem. Do you ever hear the expression to be a chacham from the manishtana? You ever heard that expression? You're a chacham from the manishtana. What does that mean, that expression? that expression means simply that, you think you're so smart, right? So the Torah itself really says it. Ein chacham mitzvuna neged Hashem. That means that you do what Hashem wants. And it's not up to us to make calculations about what Hashem does want, doesn't want, it does apply, it doesn't apply. That's the Talmud quotes that pasuk as one source. On the other hand, the Talmud also quotes another source, which is a conflict, which says, Gadol kavod habrios, shedoches lo saseh shebetorah. The kavod habrios, the respect for human dignity, for God's creations is so great that it actually pushes aside a lo saseh shebetorah, a prohibition in the Torah. So the Talmud concludes, because of this contradiction, the Talmud concludes that if something is a rabbinic violation, it's allowed for the sake of human dignity. I will give you an example. Imagine you're in shul and you want to put on a tallis, because it used to be back in the olden days that it was embarrassing to be in shul without a tallis for the men. Can you imagine? It used to be that way. And the truth is, it is still probably that way for older men that are single. If our tradition is that you don't put on a tallis until you get married, to be 55, 65, 75 years old without a tallis. So in our shul, we very quietly try to make sure that everybody has a tallis. They're married, they're not married, doesn't matter. It's like almost like the minhag of the shul. And we do what we can to make sure that, they have one. If they use a shul tallis, it's fine. But sometimes we go out of our way to make sure they have their own tallis even. Because people should have their own tallis. Pardon me?
Would they make a bracha?
Yeah, they make a bracha. If you look in the literature, and this is just a bit of a tangent, really literature, it's hard to understand why even children don't wear a tallis. It might be because they were too poor to afford it, but that's that is the custom. But many besides the fact that the German community and the Sephardic community do wear talisim from the time they're children. Obviously it's our minhag to only put on a tallis when you get married, but there's absolutely one would make a bracha. Okay, so now here's the challenge. You're sitting in shul and you realize that your tallis is puzzle. Your tallis has become invalidated. Why? Because the strings got ripped. And on Shabbos, you're not allowed to tie tzitzis. It's a rabbinic violation to tie tzitzis on Shabbos, according to the Ramah, according to Moshe Islis of the Ashkenazi Shulchan Aruch. So here you have a conflict. On the one hand, you're not supposed to, tie your tzitzis, which would be a rabbinic violation. You're not supposed to be there in a tallis, which perhaps is a rabbinic violation as well in this particular case. On the other hand, so therefore, under normal circumstances, you'd want to take off the tallis. But then you'd be embarrassed because you'd be the only person in shul wearing a tallis. So here's where you have a conflict. Being dressed in a different way than everybody else, you see back then, was something that was very embarrassing. It's harder for us to relate. In our shul, we celebrate how people dress differently, right? But okay. There's another rule, aside from the rule about the rabbinic violation, which is okay to violate in the case of embarrassment, but again, it depends on the case, which is when it comes to Torah violations. When it comes to Torah violations, there are two ways to violate what it says in the Torah. I'll say it in Hebrew first. Kum va'aseh and shevet va'al taseh. Kum va'aseh is when somebody proactively violates what it says in the Torah. The Torah says, don't do something, and we go ahead and we do it. The Torah says, do not wear shatnez, and so b'kum va'aseh, I put on a Yugo Bas suit which has shatnez in it, because more than 90% apparently of Yugo Bas suits have shatnez in it. Okay, so that's an active violation of the Torah, called in Hebrew kum va'aseh, to get up and do. On the other hand, it's something called shev va'al taseh, which means that passively, by refraining from doing something, I have violated a mitzvah. For example, if I'm a mohel and I'm on my way to a bris milah, to perform a bris milah, to perform a circumcision, and I notice a mitzvah, I notice someone needs burial, obviously I can only do one mitzvah. So can I violate the mitzvah of the Torah by not performing the circumcision? I'm not really violating anything. I'm by passively not participating in it, I'm allowing that mitzvah to be pushed off, which in a sense is a violation on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's something that I'm doing passively. So when I can uphold human dignity and maintain human dignity, so this is another rule that is going to play a role when it comes to not just only a rabbinic mitzvah, but even a Torah level, that possibly if I can, if the mitzvah is only going to be violated from a passive perspective rather than an active perspective. So then at times, the human dignity is going to trump over the mitzvah. And these are two rules that we're going to apply to other situations. Give you another example in the Talmud of where you have this kind of a conflict. In the Torah, we have concept of Beit Din. In Jewish court, you have a concept of Beit Din. And the Beit Din's job is to adjudicate cases. In America, if you get subpoenaed, you don't really have a choice. You have to show up. Is that right? If you get subpoenaed by an American court and you don't show up, you can be held in contempt of court. Is that right? How many lawyers can nod their heads here for me? Is it too complicated? Am I oversimplifying it? Probably I'm oversimplifying it. Okay, but just take it as a given, right? In America, you have to show up. What happens if a Beis Din subpoenas you? Do you have to show up? Well, says the Gemara, it depends who you are. Okay? It depends who you are. If I'm being summoned to a Beis Din that's below my dignity, that will be degrading to me because I'm a much greater Talmid Chacham than anybody else on the Beis Din. A person of my stature, I'm entitled to not go because I'm more important. The Gemara brings up such a concept. I don't know.
Rabbi, who makes that decision, whether or not you're smarter than the people on the Beis Din?
You know, I don't know the answer to that question, but the easy example is if Rabbi Yashiv, Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky is called by a Beis Din of my peers, it's a joke, right? It's a joke. The whole world knows that, you know, we're not even talking apples and oranges. We're talking like apples and animals. You know, it's a different ballgame. So that would be an extreme example, okay? So in some cases, so the Gemara basically concludes like this, you know, how do you apply this? Where do you apply it? So the Gemara says in a monetary situation, now this is not necessarily when you're being sued, you know, as a defendant, but rather, you know, testimony. And so you want to, you know, you're not in the mood, for whatever reason, you feel like it's below your dignity to go testify in this particular court. So in a monetary situation, let's say Jack is suing John for $1,000. So in certain cases, this important person has a right to not go. But by the way, you know, can you subpoena the president to show up to court? You know, in a regular matter. I don't know what this is like in American system nowadays. You know, can you subpoena the governor of California? How many people live in California? 60 million. Did I make that number up? A lot of people live in California, right? Okay, can you subpoena the governor to a nonsense case? Can you? I don't know. What do you say? Anybody know? I have no idea. Okay.
Well, I don't know, but he would not show up because he thought he was greater than anybody else who would come.
Okay.
That could be another reason.
Well, he might say, I'm too busy. You know, I don't have time for your $1,000 lawsuit. Let me just pay the money and be done with it. I don't, whatever it is, right? There are a lot of possibilities. Okay. So that's in the case of money. The Talmud says there is such a concept. By the way, you have this concept in the case of Hashavas Aveda as well, where we have a concept of zaken ve'ena lefi chvodo. The Gemara B'Metzia tells us that if a zaken, if an elderly person, a wise man or a woman, finds an item in the street that under normal circumstances you'd have a mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, you're not allowed to ignore the item, you have to pick it up and return it to the owners. But for the Rosh Hashiva to pick up I dropped my copy of Sports Illustrated on the sidewalk, and for the Rosh Hashiva to pick it up, it wouldn't be bakavadik for him to do that. So the Gemara has a concept like that, where it's zaken eino lefi chodo. It's undignified for him to do so, and therefore he's exempt from the mitzvah. He's allowed to do the mitzvah if he wants to, but the exemption from the mitzvah might be in play. Okay, Barry, you had this in Ela Mitzias way back in Ela Mitzias. Okay. What about if I could prevent a violation? Give you an example. Two people are married. They cannot start a new marriage until they resolve the first marriage. Is that right? This happened, unfortunately, in 9/11. 9/11, there were some agunas, there were some women who weren't sure about what happened to their husband. At some point, they figured that they died, but you have to some DNA evidence, something, right? There was obviously big discussions about that. But even there, where it wasn't as common, certainly after the Holocaust. How many of you saw that really nice? I don't even want to dignify it by saying really nice. I know that you all loved it. There was this clip on WhatsApp with an old man and an old woman who show up at their grandchildren getting married to each other. Remember that clip? I thought that clip was horrible because your grandchildren, one of the grandchildren for sure is a mamzer. And by mamzer, I mean halachic mamzer. I don't mean the English term for mamzer. Why? Because she got remarried without getting a get from her husband. It was, if they weren't Jewish, Mela, but I mean, they were a Jewish couple, right? So they'd been married before the war. After the war, they gave up on each other. And then eventually they found each other when their grandchildren from other spouses. Did anyone think about that when they saw that clip? It just kind of struck me. I mean, obviously there's something beautiful about it, but also something horribly sad about that too. So after the Holocaust, Moshe Feinstein, he lost years of sleep helping women, enabling them to resolve their aguna status because their husbands were missing because of the war, so that they can get remarried and start new families. My brother-in-law, I'll take a break here for a moment. My brother-in-law married my sister Siri, live in Dallas. He has a new hobby. He joined Ancestry.com. Is anybody here a member of Ancestry.com? And he's been finding documents on the family. And he sent me a document of my namesake, of Avram Gluck. Avram Gluck was my paternal grandmother's father. He got out before the war and tried to make a better situation for his family. He got stuck in America. He was deported to Cuba. He made it back to America. And he has a document, which I have on my phone, with permission from my grandmother and her siblings and their mom to all come to America, but unfortunately it was too late. They couldn't get out anymore. Really, it's an amazing document. And somehow or another, he had the wherewithal to his wife and 4 or 5 of his children were killed, everybody except for my grandmother. And they had the wherewithal to restart his life here. Just an amazing thing to think about. So imagine, people didn't know where their spouses were after the war. It's possible the woman's husband is still alive, but they can't track each other down. Ilana, you probably have hundreds of stories like that you know about. Is she allowed to get married under such circumstances? Now, let's say she's about to get married, and you, the dignified rabbi, you don't have to be a rabbi, but a dignified person who's a very, very, what's the expression, highty-tighty, highfalutin, person. It doesn't behoove you to go to this lower sort of a court. But she's about to get married, and her husband is alive because you hung out with him at Starbucks last week. So you're obligated to go to the court that's summoning you, even though it's beneath your dignity, because the consequences are extreme. So maybe you have to cost your dignity, quote unquote, but you know what? The consequences are so extreme that you have to go. Now, earlier we just said, I'm sure, Mr. Smith, you're probably thinking about this question already. We just said earlier that if the violation is passive, I can violate even a Torah violation to uphold my dignity. Didn't we just say that before? By not going to court, isn't that passive? I'm not doing anything proactively. I'm not violating the Torah. I'm violating the Torah, but from a passive perspective, because I'm not testifying. I'm sitting at home, I'm doing nothing. What do you see from here? There are different answers to this question, but one of the approaches is that there are different levels of human dignity. And depending on the severity of the issue of the human dignity, being undressed in public, a dead body lying on the road, going to court is a gnai katan, is the language of the Gemara. It's not such a great disgrace, even for a very dignified person, and therefore he is obligated to go to court. So for rabbinic prohibition, we did not make any sort of differentiation. Almost any situation is going to be okay. Again, not when the mitzvah itself is embarrassing because you're embarrassed to do that mitzvah, but when there's inherent embarrassment. For a Torah prohibition so far, we have 2 qualities that are needed. Number 1, it has to be passive. Number 2, there has to be a severe kavod habrios. It has to be terribly embarrassing for me. Because if it was terribly embarrassing and it was passive, then I would not be obligated. And I can go with the human dignity will trump over the Torah mitzvah. In America, we tell people to mind their own business. We often tell ourselves to mind our own business, don't we? Not my business. I should go talk about somebody else's stuff. It doesn't make any sense. I'm not going to tell them what to do. We had a shiur on this topic specifically. When are you supposed to say something to someone? See something, say something was the name of the shiur right before Shavuos. So it's one thing if I'm wearing shatnez in the street. What do I have to do? What if you're wearing shatnez in the street and I notice that you're wearing shatnez, or you notice that I'm wearing shatnez, a mixture of wool and linen? So should you rip my clothing off? Should I get involved in somebody else's violation? Okay. This is an argument between the Rambam and the Rush. You'll see in a moment why this question is so important. It sounds a little bit like, really, you're going to go rip off his clothing? Is that really possible? Okay. The Rambam says it applies to even somebody else wearing shatnez. The Rush says, no, you don't have to do anything about it. It's a situation of kavod habrios because he's being passive. He's not knowingly doing it. It would be degrading for him to be unclothed in public, and therefore, it's okay. And according to some, that's how we explain the machlokas, the Rambam and the Rush. What's the point of the argument? Is there an active violation? Can I be passive? Meaning, can the observer be passive? Do I have to take action even though the violation is passive? That's the way we say. Do I have to take action even though his violation is passive? Go back to the case of the adultery here. Somebody knows that the woman committed adultery. If her husband finds out, it's embarrassing for everyone, for the entire family. On the other hand, if you don't say anything, he's going to be with his wife, violating the halacha that says that a husband is not supposed to be with a wife who had an affair, a physical affair. And this is, of course, not just if you think she did, but if you know for a fact she did. And how you know for a fact is complicated, la halacha. It's not for tonight. But in this case, I guess we have enough evidence. So should you tell the husband or not? On the one hand, it's embarrassing for everybody. On the other hand, if you don't say anything, so the husband and the wife are going to be together, actively violating day in, day out. But, so maybe I'm passive and he's active. Now he's unknowingly active, right? We'll see that in a second. But he's actively doing something wrong, and I'm passive because I'm not saying anything. According to some opinions, and Yehuda offers this as a possibility, the Rush and the Rambam, the same argument we had about shatnez, they would argue about here as well. The Rambam says you cannot be silent if somebody else is actively violating, even if it's unknowingly. The Rush says no. If it's unknowingly, that means b'shogeg. He has no idea. It's an accident, quote unquote. He has no idea that it's a violation because he thinks it's their husband and wife like any other husband and wife. So the Rush says that if someone is violating b'shogeg and you know something, don't say anything. Refrain from giving notice to the husband, even though he is an active violator, because his active violation is not on purpose. Now, the Yehuda points out that normally these sorts of conflicts between kavod habrios, between human dignity and the avera, are temporary in nature. It's a one-time thing. In this case, you wait till the guy wearing shatnez gets home. Okay, but what if the violation is ongoing? Now, the Yehuda says maybe even the Rush would agree that you should say something because it's an ongoing thing. So according to everything we just said, that in order to go with human dignity against an actual sin in the Torah, number one, the sin has to be done passively. Number two, there's a strong possibility that it has to be temporary. Number three, the embarrassment has to be severe and significant. And number four, the violation that takes place is accidental. So there are many conditions necessary to go with human dignity when it conflicts with a mitzvah in the Torah itself. The Yehuda concluded he was obligated in this case to tell the husband. However, the Divrei Chaim, a great Hasidic leader who came a little while later, he wrote, once in a while we get questions like this, and he said the custom is we rule not to say anything because of the devastating situation for the family. So, like everything else, there's actually a machlokes amongst the poskim how we conclude when it comes to the situation of the adultery. If I have no compelling reason to say something, kavod habrios, this respect for human dignity is something that's very, very strong. Sometimes we cause tremendous embarrassment by saying something small or insignificant to somebody, as opposed to caring about somebody's feelings, caring about how they might feel, the embarrassment. We allow the Torah to be violated when there's a conflict with kavod habrios at times, like we saw. How much more so? We saw. I'm happy to share a handout that's much, much, much more thorough than anything I shared with you tonight. But you see how serious the rabbis take the issue of human dignity. The human being was created b'tzelem Elokim, in the image of God. The Torah itself is very, very sensitive to the respect and the dignity that a human body, even a dead human body, is due. How much more so a live human body? How much more so must we learn to be sensitive and careful when it comes to people? Halacha allows us to violate rabbinic prohibitions. Halacha sometimes allows us to violate a Torah prohibition. We're all created in the image of Hashem, and the dignity and respect that we're due to and that we each deserve is tantamount, not exactly, but it's tantamount to the respect that Hashem himself deserves. Going back to the case of the micropigmentation, to cover up a scar. So there's strong reason to say, without getting into a whole shiur about tattoos, that getting a tattoo of ink without a picture, without letters, without anything like that is a rabbinic violation. And to spare the person the day in and day out embarrassment of an unsightly, disfiguring scar, one would be allowed to use micropigmentation to cover up that scar. So hopefully I gave you a sense, a taste of how the Talmud deals with human dignity and how when you have conflict, there are rules that applied back then that we can still apply today. And I hope that everybody enjoyed. And as I said earlier, Be'ezrat Hashem, this year should be an Ilui Neshama for one of the most dignified human beings that I ever had the pleasure of calling my best friend. And his name is Ariel Avrich. And I thank you all for coming tonight. I thank you all for listening.
Rabbi, can I ask a
Thank you.
question?
Sure, Judy, go ahead.
Regarding the last point, you said it has to be by accident.
Yeah.
So how would the mohel who goes to the Mace Mitzvah for the and skips the bris, how is that an accident?
Well, there he's in a bind, right? The best example of a bind is from Freud. Freud's example of a bind is your mother gives you Father's Day, right? The wife gives the dad, or the children give the dad 2 ties for Father's Day. Okay, one is red, one is blue. Dad goes upstairs, puts on the blue tie, comes downstairs. The mom says, what, you didn't like the red tie? Okay, that's a bind. Okay, in that case, he's in a bind. He has to violate something, right?
Okay, so it's not the accident doesn't always apply.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Great
It's my
class.
pleasure.
Have a good night.
You too. All right, everybody, Laila Tov, and I thank you all for joining us tonight.
Laila Tov.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
New Barry, it's good to see you, Barry.